She was the only one who survived Henry VIII, but not her own heart. Catherine Parr outlived the king who destroyed every woman before her. She was the healer, the reformer, the queen who dared to speak of love and faith. But survival came with a cost. In the end, she didn't die by the axe, she died by heartbreak, betrayal, and silence. This is not the story of a survivor. This is the story of a woman who survived too much. Subscribe for more royal stories history tried to bury. Catherine Parr was never meant to be a queen. Born in 1512 to Sir Thomas Parr and Maud Green, she entered the world as a noblewoman, but not an heiress. Her family had good connections, but little power. What Catherine inherited wasn't wealth, it was intellect, empathy, and an unshakable sense of duty. From childhood, she loved books more than jewels. While other girls learned how to curtsy and charm, Catherine learned how to think. She spoke multiple languages, studied theology, and quietly absorbed the politics that shaped Tudor England. Her first marriage came young. She wed Sir Edward Berg, a man several years older and already ill. Their marriage was short and quiet, ending with his death. There was no romance, no scandal, only lessons in patience and resilience. After his passing, Catherine married again, to John Neville, Lord Latimer, a respected nobleman who was kind but cautious. This marriage brought her stability and rank, but also fear. During the Northern Rebellion, their home was stormed by rebels demanding loyalty to the Catholic cause. Catherine was taken hostage with her stepchildren, witnessing the raw danger of politics firsthand. It was then she learned something that would define her. Survival meant silence. You smiled, you served, and you stayed alive. When Lord Latimer died in 1543, Catherine was widowed again, still young, yet tempered by hardship. She intended to remain single and devote her life to study and faith, but destiny, as always, had other plans. That same year, she entered the royal court to serve Princess Mary, Henry VIII's daughter. There, her intelligence drew quiet admiration. She was calm, articulate, and gentle, qualities rare in a court fueled by vanity and suspicion. Henry VIII noticed her almost immediately. He was 52, obese, infected, and haunted by ghosts of the wives he'd destroyed. She was 31, graceful, thoughtful, and compassionate. He saw in her what he had long lost in himself, peace. For Catherine, the king's attention was a curse disguised as favor. She had seen what happened to those who pleased him too much, but refusing the King of England was not an option. When Henry proposed, she didn't celebrate, she prayed. She wrote later that she had never desired greatness and had wished to serve God, not a king. Yet she accepted, understanding that her choice was survival, not ambition. She would be Henry's sixth wife, following 5 ghosts, 2 of them executed by his own hand. Her wedding took place quietly in July 1543. Witnesses described her as serene, her face calm even as her hands trembled. The courtiers whispered, "She will be next." But they were wrong. Catherine Parr was different. She didn't challenge Henry with rebellion or seduction. She used something far more powerful, compassion. From the beginning, her marriage was built not on love, but on necessity. Henry needed a nurse, a counselor, a voice of reason amid his collapsing health and paranoia. Catherine became all 3. She was the first of his wives to care for him as both man and monarch. She treated his wounds, soothed his temper, and even read scripture to him at night. Slowly, the tyrant grew gentler in her presence. But Catherine knew better than to mistake calm for safety. She lived surrounded by the memories of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, both executed for being too bold. So she walked a careful line, balancing intellect with obedience, influence with humility. In a court that had consumed every woman before her, Catherine Parr was about to do the impossible, survive. But she would learn that survival came at a greater price than death itself. When Catherine Parr became queen, she didn't inherit a throne, she inherited a patient. Henry VIII was no longer the powerful king of his youth. His body was decaying from years of indulgence and disease. He was obese, suffering from open ulcers on his legs that leaked constantly. The smell alone filled every corridor he entered. Yet beneath that decaying body still burned the pride of a man who once commanded nations, and it fell upon Catherine to tend to both his wounds and his ego. Each morning began with ritual. Courtiers and physicians hovered nervously as Catherine approached his bed. She changed his bandages herself when others recoiled. She held his hand when the pain made him curse God. And when he raged at his helplessness, she answered not with fear, but with calm. "My lord," she would say gently, "even kings are mortal, but mercy makes them divine." Her words were her shield, humble enough to soothe him, wise enough to remind him of her worth. Catherine understood Henry better than any of his wives. She saw the loneliness beneath his fury, the weakness behind his arrogance. She did not try to reform him or to resist him, she learned to manage him. And in doing so, she earned something no woman before her had, his trust. In court, she became known as the peacemaker. She worked to mend the fragile relationships between Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Each represented a different faith, a different mother, and a different faction. Catherine saw in them not rivals, but a family fractured by their father's obsessions. She brought them together at meals, encouraged them to read scripture, and treated them as equals. For the first time in years, Henry's court saw harmony instead of suspicion. Yet harmony in the Tudor court was a fragile illusion. Behind every smile lurked ambition. Conservative nobles resented her influence. Reformers whispered that she could lead England toward a new faith. To the powerful men surrounding Henry, a thinking queen was dangerous. To Henry himself, she was an unsettling mirror, a reminder that power could exist in gentleness. Still, Catherine found moments of purpose. She loved theology, and her rooms became a sanctuary for quiet discussion about faith, scripture, and morality. She wasn't reckless. She never defied the church openly, but she believed in reform, in personal devotion over ritual. She wanted to bring light to a kingdom drowning in fear. But she also knew that the very ideas she cherished had already gotten others killed. To the outside world, she was the perfect wife, devoted, loyal, humble. But inside, she lived in constant tension, torn between her belief in God's truth and the need to protect her life. Henry's moods shifted like storms. One wrong word could destroy her. So she learned the art of timing, when to speak, when to pray, when to smile. Sometimes, late at night, she would write in her journal about the heavy price of wisdom. "The crown," she wrote once, "sits not in glory, but in peril." Henry, however, adored her more deeply than he ever had anyone since Jane Seymour. Catherine didn't excite him like Anne Boleyn or amuse him like Catherine Howard. She calmed him. She made him feel human, and that made her invaluable. But to survive Henry's affection was not victory, it was endurance. Every day she looked upon his face and saw the ghosts of 5 women who came before her, 2 executed, 2 cast aside, 1 dead in childbirth. She alone had managed to keep his favor. Catherine Parr, the nurse queen, had achieved what no one thought possible. She had tamed the monster. But monsters, as she would soon learn, never stay asleep for long. Catherine Parr was not a queen of vanity or jewels. She was a queen of words. In a court obsessed with appearances, she found power in thought. She was a scholar in a world that did not welcome educated women, and her mind was sharper than most men dared to admit. Even before marrying Henry, she had been drawn to learning and reformist theology. Now, as Queen of England, she used her position not for luxury, but for literacy, not to command, but to enlighten. Henry's court was divided between the conservatives, who clung to old Catholic traditions, and the reformers, who supported the Protestant movement that had begun to take hold in England. Catherine leaned toward reform, though she wore her beliefs carefully, like a veil that could be lifted or lowered depending on who was watching. She read scriptures in English, discussed faith with scholars, and believed that one's relationship with God should be personal, not dictated by ritual or fear. Her intellect was not merely private, she put it into writing. In 1545, Catherine Parr became the first woman in English history to publish a book under her own name. Prayers or Meditations was a spiritual reflection written in a voice both humble and bold. It emphasized mercy, repentance, and divine grace, ideas that subtly supported Protestant ideals of individual faith. The book became a sensation. Even Henry praised her piety. To the public, she appeared as the perfect Christian queen, gentle in devotion, flawless in loyalty. But beneath her calm words was quiet rebellion. Encouraged by her success, Catherine began writing a second book, The Lamentation of a Sinner. This one went further, describing the emptiness of rituals without faith and the need for personal salvation. It was courageous and dangerous. Every word she wrote was a risk. Every page could be twisted into evidence of heresy. Still, she couldn't stop. Her writing gave her purpose, a space to breathe freely in a palace where she constantly held her tongue. She found solace in faith, not fear. But her intelligence did not go unnoticed, and not everyone admired it. Conservative courtiers like Bishop Stephen Gardiner began whispering to the king that his wife's books and conversations were improper, that she was encouraging heretics and spreading forbidden ideas. They reminded Henry of what had happened when Anne Boleyn meddled in matters of religion. They warned him that his current queen was following the same path. At first, Henry laughed it off. "My Kate is virtuous," he said. "She reads for comfort, not for power." But doubt was a seed easily planted in the mind of a man like him, aging, paranoid, and surrounded by flatterers. Meanwhile, Catherine continued to host small theological discussions in her private chambers. She invited trusted scholars, reformist ladies, and even some of Henry's servants who shared her beliefs. To her, it was spiritual fellowship. To her enemies, it was sedition. They began keeping records, noting her visitors, her books, even her words. Despite the tension, Catherine remained serene in public. She was careful to honor Catholic ceremonies in front of Henry, while subtly promoting English scripture in private. She balanced her faith and her fear with the precision of a tightrope walker. She believed she could change hearts through grace, not force. What she didn't know was that her own grace had already drawn danger closer. The more she inspired others, the more powerful men at court began to see her as a threat. Henry's sixth queen was not young or seductive like the others. She was something far more dangerous. She could think. She could write. And worst of all, she could influence. To the Tudor court, a queen like that was not a blessing. She was a liability waiting to be silenced. By 1546, the court had turned cold. Catherine Parr's intelligence, once admired, had begun to look like arrogance to the powerful men around Henry. They couldn't bear the idea that a woman, a queen, spoke freely about religion and reform. Every word she wrote, every conversation she had about faith, was now watched closely. In the eyes of men like Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Lord Wriothesley, she had crossed an invisible line. She had begun to think too much. Gardiner had waited patiently for this moment. A shrewd, calculating man, he had seen queens rise and fall before, and he knew how easily the king's affection could turn into suspicion. He whispered poison into Henry's ear, gently, persistently. He told him that the queen was spreading heretical ideas, that she was secretly encouraging Lutheran beliefs, that she was turning the people against the church and, perhaps, against him. Henry's ego didn't need much convincing. At first, the king brushed it off. He said his queen only sought spiritual comfort. But as Gardiner and Wriothesley presented fabricated evidence, notes from her discussions, intercepted letters, even rumors about her books, Henry's pride began to bruise. The thought that his own wife might be undermining him, just as Anne Boleyn once had, twisted his heart into paranoia. The same man who had once trusted Catherine with his deepest pains now saw her as a possible traitor. Late one evening, in the flickering light of his chamber, Henry signed a warrant for her arrest. The Queen of England, the woman who had nursed him, prayed beside him, and healed his wounds, was now marked for death. Gardiner smiled. The deed was done, but fate, as always in the Tudor court, had a habit of listening. A servant loyal to the queen stumbled upon the warrant the next morning, hidden among council papers. Realizing what it meant, she rushed to Catherine's rooms and handed it to her. When Catherine read the words, her blood ran cold. She didn't faint or scream, she simply whispered, "So, it has come to this." She knew that in Henry's England an accusation was as deadly as proof. That night, Catherine went to Henry's chambers, trembling but resolute. She knelt beside his chair and spoke softly, as she had done so many times before. "My lord," she said, "if I have ever spoken out of turn, it was not from pride, but from love. I only sought to learn from your wisdom, that I might be a better wife to your majesty." Henry's eyes, heavy and uncertain, softened. Her humility disarmed him. She spoke no defense, no argument, only devotion. "I am but your humble scholar," she added, "and you, my gracious teacher." The king said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached out, touched her hand, and muttered, "You are a wise woman, Kate." The next morning, when the soldiers arrived with the warrant to arrest her, Henry turned on them in fury. "Knaves, fools! Do you dare insult the queen?" he thundered. The guards froze, terrified. Gardiner's plan had collapsed in a single night. The warrant was torn to shreds before their eyes. Catherine had escaped the scaffold by inches, not through power, but through intelligence and grace. She had turned death itself aside with humility, but she never forgot how close she had come. From that day forward, she slept lightly. She spoke carefully, and she smiled even when her heart trembled. She had survived the king's wrath, but she knew now that survival in Henry's court was not life, it was endurance. And endurance, she was beginning to realize, had a cost no crown could repay. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, England exhaled, and so did Catherine Parr. For the first time in years, she wasn't a wife, a nurse, or a political hostage. She was free. The man who had defined every hour of her life was gone. His death didn't bring her joy, but it did bring a strange, trembling peace. She had survived him, something 5 other women could not say. At 44, Catherine was now the Dowager Queen, a title that gave her wealth, status, and independence. But her heart, long suppressed beneath duty, began to beat again. Among the courtiers who came to pay their respects after Henry's death was Thomas Seymour, the handsome, reckless brother of Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife. Thomas was everything Henry was not: charming, athletic, youthful, and full of life. Before marrying Henry, Catherine and Thomas had been in love. Now, with the king gone, they were free to pursue what had once been forbidden. But freedom in the Tudor court was never simple. Thomas Seymour was ambitious, dangerously so. He wanted Catherine, yes, but he also wanted influence. His brother, Edward Seymour, had been appointed Lord Protector for the young King Edward VI, giving him near total power. Thomas resented that. He wanted his share of authority and believed marrying the Dowager Queen would elevate his standing. Catherine, blinded by love and perhaps by longing for normalcy, married him secretly within months of Henry's death. The union shocked England. Many saw it as indecent haste, even betrayal. For Catherine, it was not politics, it was escape. After years of tending to an ailing tyrant, she wanted warmth, affection, laughter. She wanted to be loved for herself, not for her crown. At first, her new life seemed blissful. She hosted small gatherings, smiled again, and spoke of future children. She even took in the young Princess Elizabeth, Henry's daughter, as part of her household. Catherine treated her like her own child, offering her the education and affection she had once provided to all of Henry's children. But trouble soon darkened her home. Thomas Seymour's behavior grew erratic and troubling. He began spending too much time with Elizabeth, who was only 14. His flirting, his late-night visits, his playful gestures, all of it scandalized Catherine's servants. At first, Catherine dismissed it as harmless teasing, but soon whispers began to spread. She caught Thomas embracing Elizabeth in the gardens, his hand resting far too long on the girl's back. Catherine's heart broke, not just from jealousy, but from betrayal. She sent Elizabeth away at once, ending their bond abruptly but saving the girl's reputation. Behind closed doors, Catherine's marriage began to crumble. The passionate man she had loved now seemed driven by greed and vanity. She began to see that her freedom had been traded for another kind of prison, one built of secrecy and shame. Yet, in the spring of 1548, Catherine discovered she was pregnant, a miracle she had long thought impossible. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream. She wrote in her diary, "God has blessed me in my latter days. May He keep this child safe." But fate had one final cruelty left. Catherine Parr, the woman who had survived the most dangerous man in England, had finally found love, hope, and life. Yet as her belly swelled and her joy deepened, so too did the shadows gathering around her. Shadows that would soon remind her that no queen, no matter how wise or kind, ever truly escapes tragedy in the House of Tudor. Catherine Parr gave birth on August 30th, 1548, at Sudeley Castle. her long-awaited child, a daughter named Mary. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter, a reward for all the pain she had endured. She had dreamed of this, holding her own baby, finally free from the cold shadow of Henry's throne. Her letters from those days were tender, almost glowing. "God has sent me comfort," she wrote, "greater than I deserve." For a brief moment, it seemed that Catherine had won, not through power or politics, but through love and motherhood. But her joy was short-lived. Within days of Mary's birth, Catherine began to feel feverish. The midwives called it childbed fever, a cruel infection that often followed childbirth in those times. Her skin burned, her mind clouded, and her strength faded quickly. Yet Thomas Seymour, her husband, her supposed protector, did not stay by her side. He was busy with schemes, writing letters to advance his power and visiting court officials, as though his wife's illness was a minor inconvenience. Catherine's ladies-in-waiting tried desperately to care for her. The fever grew worse, turning her once bright eyes wild and delirious. In her confusion, she began to speak of betrayal. She accused Thomas of wanting her dead, of poisoning her to be free for ambition and lust. Some said she screamed, "You have given me death in this cup." Others claimed she wept, whispering, "God forgive him, for he knows not what he does." Whether those words were real or fever-born, no one could be sure. But one thing was clear: the queen who had once survived Henry's wrath now lay dying, abandoned in her own chamber by the man she had trusted most. On September 5, 1548, just 6 days after giving birth, Catherine Parr, Queen of England, scholar, reformer, and survivor, took her final breath. She was only 36 years old. The last words recorded from her lips were a prayer for mercy. Her daughter, little Mary Seymour, was left an orphan before she could even open her eyes to the world. Within 2 years, Mary vanished from all records, another Tudor tragedy lost to history. No one knows if she died in infancy or lived quietly in obscurity. As for Thomas Seymour, his ambition finally destroyed him. Less than a year after Catherine's death, he was arrested for treason, accused of plotting to kidnap the young King Edward VI and marry Princess Elizabeth. He was executed at the Tower of London in 1549. When his head fell, some said it was justice for the woman he had betrayed. But Catherine's legacy did not die with him. She had changed England in ways few women ever could. Through her writings, she opened doors for religious reform and female education. Through her compassion, she softened the hearts of Henry's children, paving the way for Elizabeth I, the girl she had once protected, to become the most powerful queen England would ever know. And yet, her story remains the quietest of all Henry's wives. No scandal, no beheading, no great affair, just intelligence, faith, and an ending too gentle to be remembered. She had survived the tyrant king, only to be undone by the ordinary cruelty of life, a fever, a careless husband, a forgotten grave. Catherine Parr's story is not one of victory or failure. It's one of grace under impossible pressure. The tale of a woman who lived with intellect and died with dignity. The queen who outlived Henry VIII, but could not outlive her own heartbreak. A scholar, a survivor, a mother, and, in the end, a woman who paid the quietest price of all. History often remembers the loudest voices, the conquerors, the tyrants, the martyrs. Catherine Parr was none of these. Hers was not a story of blood or rebellion, but of endurance. She didn't die screaming on a scaffold or plotting for power. She lived by reason and faith, and in that quiet dignity she left a mark deeper than those who ruled through fear. Yet, as centuries passed, her name faded into the margins, eclipsed by the drama of Henry's other wives. But to truly understand the legacy of the Tudor age, one must return to the woman who survived it, the queen who turned survival into a form of brilliance. Catherine Parr didn't just live through Henry's tempestuous reign, she guided its final years with intelligence and grace. She transformed the court from chaos into learning, nurturing a culture of thought that would ripple into the Elizabethan Golden Age. Her influence reached far beyond her lifetime. Henry's daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become England's most powerful monarch, owed much of her education and self-discipline to Catherine's care. It was under Catherine's household that young Elizabeth learned languages, scripture, and statecraft, lessons that shaped her into the queen the world would come to revere. Without Catherine's protection during those vulnerable years, Elizabeth's story might have ended long before her crown. Catherine's intellectual courage also reshaped religion in England. Her published works, Prayers or Meditations, and The Lamentation of a Sinner, made her one of the first women in English history to voice her faith publicly and independently. Through her words, she showed that a woman's mind was as capable of reflection, depth, and spiritual insight as any man's. In an age where speaking one's belief could mean death, she spoke anyway, not to challenge authority, but to inspire understanding. That, in itself, was revolutionary. Her life, however, remains one of paradox. She was both powerful and powerless, queen and prisoner, adored and forgotten. She survived Henry's cruelty, yet love destroyed her more completely than any king ever could. She gave her heart to men who used it, her intellect to a world that doubted it, and her name to a history that nearly erased it. And still, she rose, not through force, but through faith and intellect. Modern historians are beginning to rediscover her not as a passive consort, but as one of the most educated and politically skilled women of her century. She understood diplomacy, religion, and literature at a level that outmatched many of the men who surrounded her. She championed learning and literacy among women, a radical act for her time. Every educated woman in Tudor England, and beyond, walked a little easier on the path Catherine Parr had quietly paved. If Anne Boleyn was the spark that ignited England's religious transformation, then Catherine Parr was the steady flame that kept it alive. She bridged the chaos of Henry's turbulent rule and the dawn of enlightenment that followed. In her, the Tudor dynasty found its conscience. Today, when we remember her, we don't see tragedy. We see triumph through grace. Catherine Parr's story is not about how she died, but about how she lived, intelligently, compassionately, and fearlessly in the face of a world that wanted her silent. She may not have built empires or commanded armies, but she built something greater, a legacy of reason, resilience, and quiet power. Catherine Parr, the queen who survived Henry VIII, but lost herself in the end, left behind more than sorrow. She left behind proof that gentleness could change history, and that, even in a world ruled by brutality, intellect and kindness could still reign supreme. Centuries later, when historians walk the long corridors of Hampton Court or leaf through the crumbling pages of Tudor chronicles, Catherine Parr's voice can still be heard, faint but unyielding. She speaks not through conquest or scandal, but through compassion, courage, and wisdom. Hers is the voice of survival, of a woman who lived in a time when survival itself was a victory. Catherine's story is not a tale of rebellion, it is a meditation on strength. She lived in an age when women were silenced, their worth measured by obedience. Yet Catherine dared to think, to write, and to teach. In a court full of ambition and cruelty, she held her dignity as tightly as her faith. She never sought to dethrone a king or defy a system. She sought only to remind humanity of mercy, of understanding, of the power of reason in a world drowning in fear. And that is what makes her story extraordinary. Catherine Parr did not burn bright and brief like Anne Boleyn, nor did she fade into tragedy like Jane Seymour. She endured. She endured 6 years of marriage to a man whose love could turn lethal overnight. She endured the suspicion of enemies who waited for her fall. And she endured the loneliness of being a woman too intelligent for her time. When she wrote The Lamentation of a Sinner, she wasn't merely composing prayers. She was revealing her soul. It was an admission of vulnerability, a queen confessing her flaws before God and man. But hidden within her humility was defiance, the belief that even a woman's heart and mind could hold divine truth. That act, quiet yet daring, made her one of the earliest voices of spiritual feminism in English history. Yet her humanity is what binds her to us most. She wasn't perfect, she made mistakes, trusted the wrong man, longed for love when she should have known better. But in those flaws, she became real. She was not a saint carved in marble, but a woman of flesh and hope. A woman who loved, forgave, and believed, even when the world gave her every reason not to. In her final letters, written before childbirth took her life, Catherine spoke of peace. She wrote, "Whether I live or die, I am the Lord's." It wasn't resignation, it was acceptance. She had faced the worst storms England could conjure and still found serenity within herself. Her life teaches us that true strength does not come from defiance alone. It comes from grace under pressure, from choosing faith over fear, and from loving in a world built to wound you. When people speak of Henry VIII's wives, Catherine Parr's name often comes last, the sixth, the survivor. But that word, survivor, carries more meaning than any crown. She survived tyranny without becoming cruel. She survived betrayal without losing her compassion. She survived history itself, emerging not as a victim, but as a quiet symbol of what endurance truly means. Today, her story resonates far beyond the walls of Tudor England. It belongs to every person who has ever been underestimated, silenced, or trapped by circumstance, and yet refused to break. Catherine Parr reminds us that survival is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is patience. It is the courage to live with dignity when the world gives you none. She may have died young, but her legacy is timeless, a whisper that still lingers through history. I survived the king. I survived the court. I survived the silence. And in that whisper lies her triumph, the echo of a queen who turned survival into immortality. For centuries, Catherine Parr's name rested in the footnotes of Tudor history, a quiet afterthought to the chaos of Henry VIII's reign. The world remembered Anne Boleyn's fall, Catherine Howard's scandal, and Jane Seymour's tragic death. But Catherine Parr? She was simply the one who survived. It was a label that both honored and diminished her. Survival, after all, was her crown. Yet it was also the reason her story was left unspoken. But in truth, Catherine Parr was never just a survivor. She was a rebirth for women, for faith, and for England itself. Modern historians have begun to rediscover her, peeling back the centuries of dust that dulled her brilliance. They've found not a passive wife, but an intellectual pioneer, a queen who wrote, argued, and redefined what it meant to hold power as a woman in a man's world. Her works are now studied as the earliest English writings of female theology, and her voice echoes through every woman who dares to think, speak, or write freely. In her book, The Lamentation of a Sinner, Catherine wrote, "I lament that I have been led by the world, the flesh, and the devil. But between those lines lies something far more profound, not guilt, but self-awareness." She was wrestling with the human condition, not hiding from it. She invited the reader into her struggle between love and faith, power and surrender. It wasn't the cry of a sinner. It was the confession of a philosopher. Her rediscovery has inspired playwrights, filmmakers, and novelists to finally give her voice the stage it always deserved. She's no longer portrayed as the weary widow of a tyrant, but as a woman who balanced intellect with compassion, a strategist who kept peace in a court that thrived on destruction, a healer who carried both her husband's sickness and her nation's conscience. And yet, what makes her legacy timeless isn't her scholarship or even her queenship, it's her humanity. Catherine Parr's life teaches something profoundly modern, that endurance is not silence and forgiveness is not weakness. She forgave Henry for his cruelty. She forgave Thomas for his betrayal. And through that forgiveness, she reclaimed something no crown could offer, inner peace. Imagine the world she lived in, a court where women were married for alliance, discarded for disobedience, and executed for ambition. In that world, Catherine dared to educate herself, to teach others, and to publish books under her own name. She wasn't just surviving the system, she was quietly rewriting it. Her influence lived on through Elizabeth I, who would rule England with intelligence, poise, and political brilliance, traits she learned under Catherine's care. Elizabeth's reign became the golden age of England, a time of art, discovery, and progress. Behind that greatness was the silent mentorship of a woman history almost forgot. Today, visitors who walk through Sudeley Castle, where Catherine lies buried, often find her tomb covered in fresh flowers. Strangers from across the world leave notes, prayers, and small tokens, thanking her for her courage. Her grave, once neglected, is now a place of reverence. It stands as a quiet rebellion against centuries of silence. Catherine Parr's story reminds us that history is not just written by the victors, it's preserved by those who refuse to disappear. She was the queen who survived the king, but her truest victory came long after death. She survived time. And as her voice continues to rise from the pages she wrote, one thing becomes clear. Catherine Parr did not live in Henry's shadow, she outshone it. Catherine Parr's story ends not in grandeur, but in grace. Her tomb lies in the chapel of Sudeley Castle, far from the noise of London and the intrigues of court. There, carved in stone, are the words, "To the beloved Queen Catherine Parr, wife of King Henry VIII." For centuries her grave went unnoticed, a queen buried without ceremony, her legacy half remembered. But time has a way of restoring justice, and today her name is finally spoken with the reverence it always deserved. To understand Catherine's greatness, one must strip away the gilded titles and royal portraits. Beneath the crown was a woman who lived through 6 years of quiet war, against politics, disease, loneliness, and fear. She ruled not through decree, but through intellect. She healed, advised, and forgave, even when surrounded by men who wielded power like a weapon. In a dynasty drenched in betrayal, Catherine Parr stood as proof that gentleness could endure where violence failed. When Henry died, his empire was fractured and bleeding. Yet the stability that followed was built in part upon the foundation Catherine laid. She reconciled the king with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, restoring them to the line of succession. Without her courage, England might have lost both its greatest queens. That single act of compassion shaped the future of an entire nation. Her writings, too, were revolutionary. Catherine's voice brought theology to the people in a way priests never had. She spoke in a language of love, not fear, of forgiveness, not punishment. At a time when women were expected to be silent, she taught through the printed word, daring to claim spiritual authority in a world that denied her any. The Lamentation of a Sinner remains a masterpiece of both faith and psychology, the reflections of a mind that sought meaning beyond survival. And perhaps that is why her story feels timeless. Catherine was not defined by her tragedies, but by how she faced them. She did not rage at the world or curse her fate. She accepted life's cruelty without surrendering her humanity. Her strength was not loud. It was quiet, unwavering, deeply human. In many ways, Catherine Parr was centuries ahead of her time. She embodied what modern women still strive for: balance between love and independence, faith and intellect, compassion and conviction. She showed that one could serve without submission, forgive without forgetting, and lead without cruelty. Yet history almost erased her, because her victories were not written in blood, but in patience. She didn't create chaos, she brought peace. And peace, in history's eyes, is rarely dramatic enough to be remembered. But perhaps that is the beauty of her story, that even without the fire of rebellion or the spectacle of tragedy, her light never went out. Every queen before her fell to pride, betrayal, or circumstance. Catherine Parr endured them all, and in doing so, she outlasted Henry's rage, her enemies' schemes, and the centuries' silence. Her legacy is not carved in monuments, but in the hearts of those who recognize quiet courage when they see it. In the end, Catherine Parr was more than a survivor. She was a teacher, a thinker, a woman who proved that wisdom could be mightier than fear. Her life whispered a truth that still resonates, that kindness is not weakness, and intellect is not rebellion. They are forms of power too subtle for tyrants to destroy. So when we speak of the wives of Henry VIII, remember this: Catherine Parr was not his ending. She was England's beginning. The queen who survived the king and became eternal. Centuries may have passed since Catherine Parr's death, yet her words still breathe, soft, deliberate, and full of meaning. She wrote not for glory or rebellion, but to make sense of the human soul. In her final writings, she spoke of humility, of sin and grace, and of the quiet hope that redemption was possible even in the darkest times. These were not the words of a queen commanding a nation. They were the meditations of a woman who had lived too close to both power and peril. Catherine's wisdom, though wrapped in religious reflection, was timeless philosophy. She believed that education, especially for women, was a path to moral strength. She once said that ignorance is the mother of error, a phrase centuries ahead of its time. In a world where women were expected to obey, not to think, Catherine Parr preached the radical idea that knowledge was not rebellion, it was salvation. She used her position not to dominate, but to enlighten. And through her books, she gave English women a mirror in which they could finally see themselves as capable of thought and grace. Her influence quietly shaped the moral and intellectual culture of England. The printing of her devotional works marked a new age, where faith could be personal and learning could belong to everyone. She made the written word accessible, tender, and human. Long before philosophers like John Locke or writers like Mary Wollstonecraft, Catherine Parr had already begun the conversation about conscience, freedom, and equality of the soul. But what made her truly remarkable was not just her intellect, it was her humanity. She knew pain intimately, yet never let it make her bitter. She understood betrayal, yet never lost her capacity to forgive. And in every loss she endured, husbands, children, health, and peace, she found meaning instead of despair. That quiet transformation, from suffering to understanding, is the essence of her greatness. When we think of Henry VIII's court, we often imagine a theater of greed and vanity, but in its final act stood a queen who replaced cruelty with compassion and superstition with knowledge. Catherine Parr did not fight for power. She redefined it. Her power came not from armies or alliances, but from her ability to teach, to write, and to heal. In a time when most queens fought to survive, she fought to make survival worth something. Her wisdom even shaped the next generation. Under her care, Princess Elizabeth developed the discipline and self-control that would define her reign. When Elizabeth later ruled as queen, she often mirrored Catherine's measured speech, her restraint, and her belief in intellect over impulse. Many historians believe Elizabeth's famous statement, "I have the heart and stomach of a king," carried the echo of Catherine's lessons about inner strength and reasoned courage. In that sense, Catherine Parr's true legacy was not her survival, but her influence. She built a bridge between tyranny and enlightenment, between the chaos of Henry's England and the golden peace of Elizabeth's. Her wisdom became a quiet current running beneath the tide of history, unseen but unstoppable. Today, her name is finally spoken not as an afterthought, but as an origin. She was not merely the last of Henry's wives, she was the first of England's modern minds. Her words remain as relevant now as they were 5 centuries ago, that learning, forgiveness, and faith are not signs of weakness, but the purest forms of strength. Catherine Parr's wisdom was her crown, and unlike jewels or titles, it has never faded. Catherine Parr's story closes not with the clang of swords or the roar of crowds, but with something far more profound: silence. The kind of silence that follows when truth has finally been spoken and history, at last, begins to listen. For centuries, she was known only as the one who survived. But in truth, she did much more than survive. She transformed survival into meaning. Her life was a journey through fire, not of rebellion, but of endurance. She entered Henry's world not as a young beauty, but as a woman of intellect and grace. She healed a broken king, guided his children, and changed the moral compass of a nation that had forgotten compassion. She used faith not as a weapon, but as a lantern, a way to see through the darkness of fear and power. And when death finally came for her, she did not curse it. She met it with acceptance, leaving behind not gold or castles, but words, immortal, indestructible words. Catherine's greatest victory was that she proved intelligence could be feminine and kindness could be strong. In a world that silenced women, she wrote. In a court that destroyed faith, she preached mercy. In a marriage built on danger, she loved anyway. That paradox, wisdom and vulnerability intertwined, is what made her timeless. Every queen in Henry's story had a lesson to teach. Catherine of Aragon taught dignity. Anne Boleyn taught ambition. Jane Seymour taught loyalty. Anne of Cleves taught diplomacy. Catherine Howard taught innocence. But Catherine Parr, she taught humanity. She taught that even within cruelty, compassion can endure. That even surrounded by fear, one can still choose to forgive. And that is why her story matters now more than ever. In a world still wrestling with ego, power, and betrayal, Catherine Parr's legacy whispers a truth that history too often forgets, that grace is not weakness, it is power refined by suffering. She lived through tyranny without letting it corrupt her. She faced betrayal without letting it harden her. She knew the cost of love, and yet she loved anyway. Her words still echo across 5 centuries, speaking to anyone who has ever had to endure quietly. To anyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or misunderstood. Catherine's message is not about thrones or crowns, it is about the human spirit. About choosing understanding over anger. peace over vengeance, purpose over fear. Today, when you walk through Sudeley Castle and stand before her tomb, you don't feel sorrow. You feel calm, because you know she got the ending she deserved, not in life, but in legacy. She may have been buried quietly, but her wisdom has outlived empires. Her words, once whispered in secret, are now read by millions. Catherine Parr reminds us that history is not just about those who shouted the loudest. It is also about those who chose to speak softly and still change the world. She was the last wife of a king, the first woman to publish under her own name, and perhaps the only one who truly understood the meaning of power. Not the power to rule, but the power to heal. Not the power to command, but the power to endure. Not the power to conquer, but the power to forgive. That was Catherine Parr's true reign, and it is one that has never ended. Catherine Parr lived, loved, and lost in ways history rarely forgives. She was the queen who survived Henry, but not her own heart. Her story isn't just history, it's a warning. Subscribe for more stories of forgotten women who dared to live in a world that only let them survive.